Welcome back to another installment of my X-Men reviews. Once again, I am reviewing all of the X-Men movies leading up to the film release of Deadpool and Wolverine. So last time we talked about X-Men, the first movie, and we decided that it was a pretty good movie, a very underrated movie in my opinion. But we still have another movie to talk about. It's a sequel to this one. X2, or X-Men United, directed by Bryan Singer. The highly acclaimed sequel is one of those movies that pretty much universally in the comic book community is kind of like, yeah, that's pretty good. And I will say this though, I don't understand why this movie has a couple different titles. Some people call it X-Men 2, X2, X-Men United. Kind of just reminds me of people, instead of calling it Terminator 2 Judgment Day, it's called T2. So it's just a little weird thing, but I still like it nonetheless. This movie improves on a lot of stuff. Starting off from the very beginning, we already know that the movies kind of have a pretty powerful opening for the most part. This one is just as good, if not better, actually, than the first movie. We start off with the White House assassination scene, which is a great startup because it's so fast-paced and quick and frenetic, and it is amazing to see on the screen. Because at first you're really not understanding what's going on at the beginning. You're just kind of like, what is happening with this weird guy walking around in the White House? Like, I'm not exactly sure what's supposed to be going on here. But then all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, it's a mutant and he's in the White House and he's looking to, harm the president per se. And I gotta say, they did Nightcrawler's justice in this movie. You see, the teleportation effect is kind of touched on in a couple different, sort of movies and TV shows, but none really feel as unique as this one. Because if you're familiar with the comics or even the X-Men shows even, there is the coveted comic book, title screen where it says BAMF with all the smoke that comes out from when Nightcrawler teleports to a different direction. And I think this scene illustrates that ability very, very well. He flies around the screen entirely, and I think it's just awesome to see. He kind of floats at some points, but it's okay because he's cool. He's a blue devil and he's just kicking everybody's ass. It's amazing to see. And again, the little touches in the scene that I love too, outside of just how cool he looks and like, again, how fast the editing is and how fast the camera work is to really show the chaos of this scene, is I really love the part early on in the scene when he's still running around through the hallways a little bit. One of the security guards gets on the walkie and says that there's an intruder, and then when he looks to the other direction, he sees Nightcrawler again, but then he goes, there's multiple people here. Because at the beginning of the scene, they're not sure exactly who it is and what's going on, so they just assume it's multiple people rather than just a teleporting person who happens to be blue. The scene ends abruptly, and it is amazing because we see Nightcrawler about to stab the president with a knife, but then he is shot, and he's almost, kind of shocked by this and kind of just disappears, and it's kind of like, oh, that was a little bit of a weird way for him to kind of just run away. But then we see the knife hit the desk, and as the camera tilts, it says mutant freedom now. Clearly an indication to the audience that this has to do with Magneto. Who else would it be? Although Magneto is still trapped away in jail with all the plastic stuff around him so he doesn't move any of the metal. Ooh, this is interesting now. The plot then continues to develop. We kind of find out where everybody is right now in the story. We see Logan finding Alkali Lake. This was a place that was given to him to kind of, ignite the memories in his head that he has somehow forgotten. We then catch up with the X-Men who are at the museum. This is where we get a pretty nice sort of introduction to Rogue back here, and then we see Bobby, who is Iceman, and then their third wheel friend, who's Pyro. And I will say, I'm not the biggest fan of Pyro in these movies. I think he's just a whiny little punk ass. But, he is what he is. It doesn't move me either way per se, but it's a fun little scene here and there. But really what's the kicker in this portion of the story is the stuff that's going on with Jean Grey. Famke Janssen, who plays Jean Grey in this movie, has way more to do in this than she did in the previous one. We start to see her kind of have a couple of moments to herself where all the voices in her head start to talk a little bit more than they should, and it's kind of getting to her. Similar to how Charles talked about his experiences the first time with his powers when all the voices were kind of taking over. Even though he doesn't have the telekinetic powers, at least he can relate to Jean in that instance. You then get a nice little, dynamic with Cyclops there where, Jean kind of tells him that she feels like there's something wrong that's about to happen, to where they kind of embrace. And then the scene kind of ends once, you get the students kind of riling up a couple of people, which you get a really cool shot, I will say, of Charles Xavier's power kind of being at play. You see this only a few times in this franchise, where he has everybody stop in their tracks except for specific people, which is pretty much the mutants. And it's just a really cool scene. It almost looks like mannequins walking around everywhere. Once that happens, we are finally introduced to the actual main villain of this story, which is William Stryker, played by Bryan Cox. This guy is just a generic old soldier who is just working for the government, trying to, find out what happened at the White House stuff. He has a certain disdain for mutants that we are really seeing right off the bat, and it gets even worse as the movie goes on. This is prevalent because we see Stryker looking to invade the mansion that Charles has for all of the mutants. And he doesn't know exactly all the ins and outs of it and who's there and what they can expect, so he ends up going to visit Magneto. We then see Magneto kind of put almost in a trance at this point because Ian McKellen is old in this movie, and so he has no willpower over this whatsoever. So we see Stryker basically get the information from him, and then it cuts back to the school. This is the part where the movie starts to really pick up, and I really tend to enjoy a lot of this stuff here. Logan returns to the school after Alkali Lake. He joins up with Rogue. They hug for a moment. It's a nice little character dynamic that they still have here that I just love to see. Again, this is probably the last of it at this point, because once those other movies come out, it's kind of just not dealt with again. But as he returns, he also finds out that Charles needs to find the mutant that was behind the White House assassination, and then he must go talk to Magneto because all of these things are just kind of not adding up to him right now. So Logan is left to be taking care of the mansion with all the students there, while Jean and Storm end up trying to find Nightcrawler, and Charles and Cyclops end up trying to go talk to Magneto. This is the part where everyone kind of is shown to be doing separate things as well, especially on the villain side, because then outside of Magneto, we also get Mystique in this movie doing a bunch of cool stuff. Mystique ends up also looking for other information about Stryker, so she finds all of the details of all the plans that he has with this new Cerebro-looking machine, and then eventually you get to see more of her powers at play, where she tries to run away from one of the assistants that Stryker has by shapeshifting into one of the guards. We also then find more information about Nightcrawler in this, and it's a really touching moment because Jean and Storm are there to kind of comfort him and ask the questions about the White House incident, and then he finds out that he has the same mark on the back of his neck that Magneto does, so then you realize, oh, Stryker was behind this all along. Simultaneously, as this is happening, we get probably one of the best scenes in this movie. It's contention for one of them. It's the mansion invasion scene. Logan is peak at this point. Hugh Jackman is awesome here. I loved all of the kind of chaotic moments here where all the students are running rampant and using their powers to kind of alert everybody else that, hey, the mansion is not safe right now. We need to go and we need to leave. But then Logan, having just the berserker rage of a lifetime, at least to this point, he just kills a bunch of guards, and I just love how he kind of goes about it because it shows his military background that we kind of get glimpses of at this point in the story, walking around corners and kind of taking people out slowly and, kind of running up on people, jumping off the scaffolding almost. It is so fun to see. It's Hugh Jackman's performance in this is awesome to see. Again, the camera work and the editing here is fast, quick-paced, and there's a lot of great shots here. Like I said, him jumping off the balcony and hitting one of those guys off of it is just great. And it also shows a little bit of the violence that X-Men has here. You see, there's reasons why I like the X-Men franchise to an extent slightly more than Avengers movies, because while the Avengers stories have a lot of great connective tissues and stuff like that, and, there's a lot of great acting in those movies, and I understand that, I think the violence in these movies is taken seriously, and it doesn't feel very glossed over. It's so serious, and it's kind of like, it's almost for the mature folk, almost. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think Avengers movies are bad because they don't have blood and guts. I mean, obviously, take with what you get. I think, again, those movies are great, but there's something different about the X-Men and how it's portrayed and stuff like that, and I just appreciate it more, especially when you think of these movies coming out in the early 2000s. This was, again, the predecessor to all the Avengers movies. The Avengers movies were way more consumable by the mass public, whereas these movies kind of felt like, oh, it's a little too serious at times. But in the end, I still enjoy it that much more. The scene ends with more Easter eggs to the rest of the story. We see William Stryker getting face to face with Logan here, talking about how they have a certain past together. So it's left on a little bit of a cliffhanger, because then we see William Stryker kind of talking to him, seeing that he can try to maybe, coax him to be on his side. But then Iceman, Rogue, and Pyro end up telling him that he needs to leave so that they can all be safe. This then leads to more further developments in the plot for Stryker and the rest of the villainous acts that he's going to do. He basically has a son that has a similar power to Charles Xavier, but he wants to take out the mutants entirely. So once he'd captured Magneto earlier in the story, he has placed something on his head to where he has suppressed powers now. He is now under the control of Stryker's son, who ended up attending the school, but Charles did not take away his power like he wanted to. He further enhanced his power. So Stryker has this insane sort of discrepancy against mutants. He thinks that they are no good, they are bad, and they should all be taken away. But he also doesn't mind using mutants to also get to that point. There's some great scenes too after this point as well, because you also get the scene where you have Bobby go home because Jean and Storm are in Boston, so now Logan and everybody have to travel there to try to, gather all the X-Men up and try to take down Stryker now. We see Bobby then say that their parents live in Boston and that they could go take a visit there, at least for a moment. This is one of the most powerful scenes in the X-Men franchise. It's definitely one of those scenes where, again, we talked about this slightly in the first review, where I talked about how the prejudice and discrimination is kind of rooted in these stories. And this is no different right here, because Bobby never told his parents that he was a mutant and that he was going to the school for gifted, and the parents thought, no, he's just gifted because of his brains, not because he's an actual mutant. But the scene is just great because you could, attribute it to many things, the most obvious of them being somebody coming out as gay to their parents. And I just love one of the lines that the parents gives at the end of the conversation when he shows them that he actually is a mutant.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
And once again, let's see the, counter for more sassy Wolverine right here.
This mutant problem is a little...
What mutant problem?
Complicated.
What exactly are you professor of, Mr. Logan?
Art.
This then leads to some more fun things with Logan and the rest of the kids now showing off their powers a little bit more. We see that one of his brothers had called the cops on the mutants that are now in his house. So now Logan is trying to leave, but then gets shot in the head. He sees a little bit later on that Logan ends up pushing the bullet out of his head and taunting the cop at the end. But you get Pyro kind of doing some stuff here. And the scene isn't terrible, but I was just also kind of once he burns up a lot of these cop cars and starts to be those dangerous mutants that you've heard about, I'm one of the worst of them. It's just kind of dude, you're a kid, you should know better at this point. So it's a little bit of a weird part in the story here for sure here. But then once Rogue kind of suppresses his powers, they find Jean and Storm, and then they're off to the races. This is then kind of laced together with chase scene with some airplanes, and we see more awesome uses of Storm's power in this, where she tries to have tornadoes and stuff kind of pop up to kind of throw other airplanes off of their tail. But when Jean kind of fails to have one of the missiles kind of explode on its own, it then leads to their ship exploding, at least in the backside. So then Nightcrawler has to save Rogue from flying out of the ship into the sky. So just more fun stuff for Nightcrawler to do in this with the limited time that he was, at least in the first half of the franchise here. This then leads to the unlikely team up of Magneto and Mystique teaming up with now all the X-Men here looking for William Stryker. This is then where we learn that also William Stryker was the reason that Wolverine has all of this adamantium in his body now. So now there's just more added stuff to the story that makes it even more intriguing and more entertaining, and now we get to see that Logan has much more of a motivation now to go back to Alkali Lake than just, oh, Charles might be there. There's some other fun moments here too with Mystique that I'm also going to highlight here too, where she oversees that Logan and Jean have a kiss because Logan is in love with Jean, even though she does not feel the same, obviously. So Mystique ends up transforming into Jean, and as they're camping out, she kind of is coming on to Logan, but then he finds out that it's really Mystique because of the claw marks in her stomach from the previous fight that they had in the first movie. It's just a fun little thing. I don't know. Mystique doesn't get a ton of stuff to do at times, especially in these first few movies. So anything that she does, like, it comes across as badass, at least to me in instances. Like, this whole scene here is like, she taunts him with like kissing Jean, and then she turns into Storm, and then at one point she turns into Rogue, and then he taunts him even more by turning into William Stryker at one point. So like, just Mystique being a total bitch basically, and just being like, haha, fuck you, Logan, like, I'm cool, and you know, like, I almost made you like have sex with me because, like, you know, I could shapeshift into Jean for you. So again, it was really funny to watch that. And also, you had Magneto and her kind of talking amongst themselves like little, you know, schoolgirls, being like, we love what you've done with your hair against Rogue. And it was just funny. I don't know why. It's just, it feels like Mean Girl shit here. I don't know. This then leads to the back third of the movie here, where we end up getting the rest of the film taking place at Alkali Lake. Moments here, there are some great ones, and then there are some tiny ones here that really don't matter too much. One of them being Jean Grey and Cyclops is kind of like one of those moments where it's like, ooh, I wish this made, you know, me feel more, but it kind of doesn't. It's a quick fight, and it doesn't really lead to much. It just gives a reason for Jean to kind of be hobbled for the back half of the movie. But obviously the big stuff in this part of the movie is we find out that Charles is going to be using the machine because of William Stryker's son to make sure Cerebro, his makeshift Cerebro machine that he made, turns on and kills all the mutants. So in order to get into Alkali Lake, we then get the awesome scene with Mystique yet again pretending to be Logan as he is walking through the tunnel to see him, and then they quickly find out that it's not actually Logan. She fights off a bunch of the bad guys, and then as she's sliding through underneath the door to get into the control center, she flips him off, because Mystique in this movie is way cooler than Jennifer Lawrence. I said it here, and I'll say it later on. Don't you worry. But one of the best fight scenes in the X-Men franchise, and some people's favorite fight scene, is definitely up there for me, is when Logan faces Lady Deathstrike. We see Logan then find the experimentation room where he was in, with all the claw marks everywhere and the adamantium that is boiling over, and we see that Stryker kind of, him have a one-on-one for a brief moment, but then Stryker decides to tell him to kind of tick him off like, I thought you were special. And then he was like, I was wrong, implying that he's created more mutants that were better than him. This is where you get Lady Deathstrike. This assistant's been running around with Stryker for a while. This is obviously the person that was running around helping capture Cyclops and Charles towards the beginning of the movie. And then you see her in the little assistant's room earlier on in the movie. So she's had a presence throughout the entire movie, but this is the part where she gets even more action in this movie. And the fight, once again, is killer. Bryan Singer, for as much of the bad stuff as he was reported doing, obviously, he knows how to direct a movie, at least. The scenes with those two fighting is so fast-paced, and they're, you know, fighting back and forth, like slashing each other's faces, really highlighting the healing factor and the oh shit moment where her claws actually come out of her fingernails. Like, it's just a really fun fight to watch, and it's really intense, too. One of my favorite shots in this scene is the part where the camera kind of starts from the top of the ceiling, kind of zooms down, and you see Logan kind of stab Deathstrike in the gut, so it kind of like almost pulsates back a little bit, but then it goes right back to zooming in. It's just a really fun, creative shot, and it really shows like the kind of force that they have, because they're just throwing each other around everywhere and they're breaking things and all of that. Eventually the fight ends in almost a brutal yet beautiful fashion in a way. They are both by the adamantium experimentation, so what Logan ends up doing is kind of injecting Lady Deathstrike, over-injecting her with adamantium, so she sinks at the bottom of the tub that she would have been in to be fused with the adamantium. It's beautiful in a way, almost, and horrific too, because you see, you know, the metal kind of coming out of her eyes and coming out of her nose and a little bit of her mouth. It's really gross and kind of just like an off-putting moment, but at the end of the day, it's almost just like Logan's kind of put her out of her misery at this point. So it just was one of those moments I was just like, oddly beautiful in a way. I really don't know how else to describe it, to be honest with you. But this wouldn't be a superhero movie without Magneto completely shitting the bed for everybody towards the end of this movie, would it? Would it? Because then we see Magneto basically turn on the team, and he ends up reversing the experiment now on Charles. So now Charles is now using his power against people who are non-mutants. So now they have to break Charles out. again. This gives another highlighted moment for Storm and Nightcrawler to have here, where Nightcrawler is afraid to kind of teleport through a closed door because he had mentioned that there's a chance that they could end up inside the door and that they could kill them. Just a fun scene for there, and then you get Halle Berry doing more stuff as Storm, making sure that the cerebral room gets very ice cold so it kind of breaks the trance that Charles is in. Just more fun stuff for her to do because she kind of gets like the lesser things to do in this franchise, and it really shows. So having some moments like this at least helps slightly. So as the X-Men are about to leave Alkali Lake, there is some other moments here that I enjoyed. We had Logan tying up Stryker to the bottom of one of the planes, and them kind of having a conversation back and forth about the experimentation that he had on him. And one of my favorite lines in this is when Stryker basically told him that you're an animal, you've always been an animal, and I've just gave you claws.
Who am I? You are just a failed experiment. Ah! If you really knew about your past, what kind of person you were, the work we did together. People don't change, Wolverine. You're an animal then, you're an animal now. I just gave you claws.
Again, just more of like the background to Logan's story that I just love, and you know, the animalistic side of him too. I just find enjoyment out of it. It's one of my favorite characters, and like it's just more layers for him in this movie that they really try to highlight. We then get towards the end of the movie where Jean Grey ends up sacrificing herself for the betterment of the team so that the dam that is breaking for Alkali Lake washes over her and not the entire plane with everybody inside of it. And this is actually the one and only time I think that Cyclops and Logan actually kind of tend to have a little bit of a heart-to-heart and a little bit of kind of like a coping way with it, because they both technically love Jean, and this is like the first time where they kind of like respected each other enough because of her death, at least at this point. But I will say another thing that I didn't like about this movie, though, is once again, they just really didn't do Cyclops justice, and it shows here. Like, he is kicked out of the movie for the majority of the time. Like, once he is captured with Charles at Alkali Lake, like, that's it. Like, he's just like out for the movie for a while up until he has that fight with Jean. You do not see him for a very long time. But the movie ends with the X-Men going to the White House, where the president's going to address the nation with the cameras. He then lets him know that we are here to stay and help. Mutants are not all bad. Stryker was one of those people that were out to hurt them, and they're here to stay. But the real kicker of this movie is the real tease for the third movie, where the camera pans over the entire water that happened from the dam breaking at Alkali Lake, and you see just the slightest bit of a red shadow of a phoenix. So the movie ends with the tease of that story coming up. If you're not familiar, we will dive more into that into the next movie. Overall, I thought the action was much better in this movie, especially with the mansion scene, and then you had Lady Deathstrike, and like, you know, the Mystique scene. Like, there's so many moments in this where the action is done far better than the first movie. You get a lot more character development with way more people, excluding a few, obviously, but Jean obviously gets way more to do, Logan gets way more to do, Mystique gets a lot to do, Charles gets a lot to do in an instance when he's kind of manipulated throughout the back half of the movie. There's just so much stuff here. Like, even Bobby gets some stuff to do with Rogue. Like, there's just so much character development in this for a lot of different people, and I could see why people loved this movie. The camera work was fantastic, as always, in this. I thought that there were some great shots, great long takes, once again, as stated in all the other scenes that we've talked about. It is kind of a shame that this is the only film that Nightcrawler is in for at least the first iteration of the X-Men, until we get a different one later on, which is not my favorite. With all that being said, I'm going to give X2 X-Men United 4.5 stars. Thank you guys so much for watching. Look forward to more reviews very soon. You can find all my socials down below. You can also go to my TikTok page and see all the other reviews that I can do there, as long as Letterboxd. Take it easy, guys, and I will talk to you all next time.